Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, Fish Den 365. I'm Den Haring, and recently I had a new subscriber, Jacob Wolf, reach out to me, and he had a really good question that I thought I would try to do my best and answer in this video. He says here, I've learned so much from your videos about techniques and baits, but would love to know more about your rod and reel choices. Have you ever done a video on that topic, or would you consider it? Like, what type of rod do you use for stripers at night? Topwater versus jigging spoons. I want to invest in some proper gear, but the choices are mind-blowing. Thank you, and I hope this finds you well. Jake. Thanks, Jake. That's a great question, and boy, man, you can go down a rabbit hole in trying to answer this. I actually took time, days, thinking about how best to answer this question, because it's not a simple answer. It depends on a number of things. It depends on if you're in a boat or not, if you're fishing from shore, your skill level, the equipment that you have available, the line you're using, the hooks, even the split rings, and if you're using snaps. All those things matter when you're fishing for big fish like stripers. And so I'm going to focus my answer on striper fishing because you had specifically stated that, top water at night, for example, versus jigging spoons, that kind of thing. And so here we go. I'll try my best to get started with this, and I'll start with the basics, and then I'll try and get into some more of the details and the thought that goes behind the choices that I make. So first up is so if you're fishing from the shore, it's a different deal than if you're fishing from a boat. And the reason for that is it all comes down to how you fight that fish. And I don't know anybody who's a better shore angler for stripers than my own brother, Martin Haring. He's been doing this at night for years, and he's got it down to a science. So, Martin, what he'll typically do is he'll use a rod that's pretty heavy action, as heavy as he can get away with, and still cast the lure that he's casting. Now, he's casting big baits most of the time. He likes to use a large Rebel minnow lure. He's actually using a lure this size. He joints the lure and then uses that. But you get an idea for the size of the bait that he's using. And both Martin and myself, we've been doing this for a long time now. We both started fishing for stripers in earnest, probably late 80s, very early 90s. And you learn a lot when you first get started with this. And one of the things that Martin learned is that when you're fishing from shore and you get one of these big stripers on, the first thing they do is they take off. They just take off right away, and oftentimes they'll try and go down. And at night, these stripers are in shallow. And so what can happen is they can go right down to the bottom. And, he learned the hard way over the years that if the striper grabs that front hook, that back hook could hook up on something, and you can lose the fish. And that happened to him a few times. So my brother's got this down to the point now where he doesn't even use a back hook. He pulls the back hook off, uses a larger center hook, and throws his bait that way. And he has total confidence doing it because he knows that most of the strikes he's getting, they're aiming for the head. They're hitting the head part of the bait. He has reported to me multiple times that he has not missed strikes, and he has not lost fish since he's done this, since he's taken the back hook off on his retrieves when he's fishing from shore. So there's a lot of things that can fail when you're striper fishing, right? Your line can break. These hooks can bend out, and stripers are strong enough to do all these things. If your split rings are cheap, they can come right out. If you've got a cheap snap, or if you're using a swivel or a snap, that can break and bend and come out. So because these fish they're big, they get large, they have a pretty good jaw strength when they're clamping down on a lure, and they could really pull hard. And so those combinations of things can make things go wrong. So fishing from shore, the answer would be you use a rod that is the heaviest you can get away with and still throw the bait as far as you need to throw it. That's a different story from a boat. You think about striper fishing and you think about, well, what kind of tackle should I be using? And to me, there's two schools of thought. There's a school of thought that says, I'm fishing for stripers, therefore I must use a high capacity reel, a heavy line, a big, meaty, heavy rod. And generally you're throwing bigger lures or live bait. And if I was throwing live bait, I'd probably do all those things if I was fishing from a boat or from shore, because you can get the bait out there, and once the bait's out there, then you have what you need to land those fish. But the other, and that's the one school of thought, but there's another school of thought that I subscribe to, and that is I want to use the equipment that best fits the technique that I'm doing, not considering so much the size of the fish that I'm catching. And the reason why I say that is because the technique, the specific technique, sometimes requires the right equipment to do it right, to throw it right, to work the bait right, to get it out far enough. And so when you're fishing stripers year-round, from spring right through wintertime, you might be, at one day in the spring, you might be throwing a lure that you're reeling along the top like this. But then come wintertime, you might be throwing a little blade bait that's only a quarter of an ounce in weight. So you can't throw a quarter ounce blade bait on a heavy action bait casting rod and huge bait casting reel. It's just not going to work. So from my point of view, because I fish from a boat 95% of the time, I look at it that from a technique specific point of view, I want to use the equipment that allows me to get the best out of the technique and lure that I'm throwing, regardless of the size of the fish. And I have confidence that I can catch those fish even if I don't have the heaviest rod or the biggest capacity reel. And that's because I learned how to do this over the years. This doesn't come right, it doesn't come naturally, and it doesn't come right away. The first time I went fishing for stripers, I was on the Delaware River, and I was fishing this bait, a bait that I caught a number of nice walleye on in the Delaware. And one day, it was just after dark. I threw this out there, and I got a fish on like no other fish I ever had on before. It pulled so hard, my rod went right down to the water, and it was just going downstream full speed. And I had 17-pound test line on, and it didn't matter. I don't remember if the line broke or if the hook straightened out. Pretty sure the hook just straightened right out, and that fish came right off. And that was because I didn't know what I was doing at that time. I had a good pretty heavy rod that I was throwing, a medium heavy rod for the bait. And I actually had a high capacity reel. I had a very old Garcia, one of the old style bait casting Garcia reels. This thing was one of my favorite reels at the time. It was so old it didn't even have a drag. You press a button and the whole reel handle would go around and you could back reel with it. Well, when that striper hit, he took that thing so hard, it back reeled and bashed the heck out of my knuckles, which made me almost drop the rod. And then when I grabbed onto the rod, the next thing I knew, this thing was just taking off, and I had my thumb down on the spool, and the hook failed, and that was that. So over the years, I learned where the failure points are and how to mitigate them or how to eliminate them in my fishing. So one of those failures is the hooks. So, and it doesn't mean that you have to use double strong or triple or quadruple strong hooks, although it doesn't hurt to do that. It may hurt a little bit to get the hook in the fish's mouth as well as a thinner hook would. It doesn't mean you have to do that. What it means is you have to be able to fight that fish in a way where he can't take advantage of that situation. And so in a boat, I have a lot of options when I'm fighting a fish. If the fish is going and running out line, I can chase after it. I can get on my trolling motor and chase after that fish and catch up so that it's not as likely to spool me, for example. So there's options you have when you're on a boat versus when you're fishing from shore. And I've learned over the years how to land these fish. This rod right here is probably the rod I've caught more stripers with than any other rod. And it's because I like to topwater fish for them. And I like to blade bait fish for them. And I use the same rod for both. This is a Daiwa light and tough topwater twitching rod. You can see it's not a very heavy rod. It's not big and thick. I would classify it as medium, a medium strength rod. I wouldn't call it medium heavy even. It doesn't have that kind of verbiage on it. It does say model TL661 3RB. It's 6 foot 6 inches long. It's not even that long of a rod. Why not? Because when I'm fishing topwater, I'm twitching and I'm not very tall. So my rod is pointed down at the water and I'm doing this. A lot of times I'm twitching topwater baits. So I don't want to be smacking the surface of the water with my rod. So I use a 6.5 foot rod. What else does it say? It says 1/8 ounce. These lures for this rod are 1/8 ounce to 1 ounce. So that's a wide range of lures. And I find that this is set up that allows me to do that pretty well. I don't go to a 1 ounce on this bait. on this rod, hardly at all. But 1/2 ounce, absolutely. 3/4 ounce sometimes. And then the pound test on here is 8 to 14 pound test. That you can't really even, that's looking at it from a point of view of mono or fluorocarbon, not braid. And I use braid with a leader. So I use this rod, the 6.5 foot rod. I've caught fish 30, 35 pounds on this rod of different species. Flathead catfish, I've caught big stripers on it. I know how to use this equipment, and I know how to set these lures up so that it's not so likely to fail when I'm trying to land one of these monster fish. That takes time to learn. You got to know where the weak points are. You know, you got to know how to set this drag so that they don't bend out the hooks. They take the line out instead. But once you get to that, once you dial all that stuff in, you can catch these fish. You can wear them down and you can catch them. Now, there's something I should say about that too, and that is that in fresh water, which is where I like to fish for stripers, they're really a saltwater fish, but they spawn in fresh water, and because of that, they found out that they can live in fresh water year-round because they accidentally landlocked them when they made the Santee Cooper reservoirs, the Lake Moultrie and Marion. They accidentally landlocked some stripers that were going up those rivers when they made the dam. That's how they found out these stripers could live in fresh water, and so they're a great freshwater fish, but they're really meant more to be in salt water. So in fresh water, if you have water 60 degrees or in a 65, under 70 degrees, all the way down to very cold water, you know, all the way down to freezing, you catch a fish and you play that fish, and you bring him in and you revive him, he's going to be fine. He's going to swim off. Anything over 70 degrees, the bigger the fish, the more likely they're not going to survive it. Like if you catch a fish in 80-degree water, for example, and it's fighting, to the point of total exhaustion because you're using lighter gear, then you're probably not going to have that fish survive. So if you're in that situation, if you're fishing for stripers and the water's that warm, you do want to use, and you want to release them, you do want to use the heaviest gear you can get away with, so you can get them in as fast as you can so that they have a chance to be released and be okay. Usually what I do in the summer is I don't fish for them so much once that water temperature goes a whole lot above 70 degrees. Most of my fish then are accidental because I'm fishing for smallmouth and largemouth during that time until the fall when the water starts cooling down again. But you can set up your gear so that you can land these big fish. And you know, this is a topwater twitching rod, but it just so happens because of the way the tip action of this rod is such that I can really do a nice job spooning and jigging a blade bait with it as well. So it ends up being the rod. I have three of these, three identical rods. It ends up being my rod of choice for blade baiting and spooning. And it's just kind of funny that Jake asked that question. Well, what about topwater and spooning? And here I use the same rod. Now that doesn't mean everybody else has to, but it's what works for me. And I've done it long enough where I'm very comfortable doing that and know that I have a lot of confidence that I'm going to catch whatever I hook doing that as well. Now, you know, that being said, I also like to fish a bait like this. So this is a jig with a Kitech swing impact fat on the back of it. And this is a smaller one, but I like to fish larger ones too for these bigger stripers. Now when I'm throwing this, it's a whole different deal, right? It's a heavier bait. I need a heavier rod to work with it. I'm usually throwing a 1/2 ounce, even all the way up to a 3/4 ounce, maybe even more, to get this bait to have a fast fall, to trigger these fish when they're down deep, or to get it down deep so that I can retrieve it at the level the fish are in. So then for that situation, I'm going to choose a different rod. So this one here is a 7-foot medium heavy rod. Now I'll also use heavy action rods if the weight of the bait is heavier. You know, if I'm going up to that 3/4 range, I'll use a heavy action rod because it's the right rod for the technique that I'm using for what I'm throwing. I focus more on that than the species of fish that I'm after. I don't want the species of fish so much to dictate the tool I use as much as the actual technique that I'm using. But when I'm using something heavy like this, it's a heavier rod, medium heavy, maybe even heavy action. You know, I like a high-speed reel no matter what I'm doing these days because you can just, the stripers are so fast, you can hook them and they can swim at you, and it's really hard to catch up to them when they do that. So the faster reels like 7.1 to 1, 8.3 to 1, even 9 to 1, they seem to be maybe that's a little on the faster side, but those faster reels, 7.3, 8.3 to 1, those are the reels that I like because I can catch up a lot of line in a hurry if I have to. And I probably use a little bit of a slower reel on my top water twitching, maybe 6.8 to 1, only because I don't want to be reeling. When you're doing a twitching technique, you only reel to catch up the line. You have to have slack in that line when you make that bait twitch, whether it's a top water or whether it's a jerk bait under the water. The same twitching motion applies. You twitch that bait, there's a little bit of slack in the line, that's what makes the bait dart, that slack in the line, and then you just reel up before the next twitch. If you reel too much, you don't get the action out of the bait that you need. It just starts to come in more straight, and it doesn't look like it has that injured bait fish profile. I'll use bait casters most of the time. There are times when I'll go striper fishing, and this has happened to me several times where the bite might shut off on a blade bait or a spoon, and I'll go to a spinning rod because I go to a light small jig head with maybe a little fluke on the back of it, or a smaller one of these, like a 2.8 swing impact fat, or even an easy shiner from Kitech, a 3-inch, something small. And sometimes that's the only thing you can get them to bite on in the winter when it's cold. But when it's cold, when that water's real cold, the stripers, they're still real strong and they still fight great, but not like they would when the water's in the 50s or 60s. So you can get away with lighter gear because they're not gonna have the acceleration as fast as it would be if the water was a little warmer. And so I'll just use a spinning rod that's best suited to throw that bait, and I won't worry about it. And I'll have 10-pound test on that rod. I'll have 10-pound test braid with maybe 8-pound test leader, and I just fight that fish to the point where I can get him to the boat without breaking anything, without bending a hook out, and without breaking line. That's the whole key. To me, it's using the rod for the technique, and then knowing how to fight that fish when you do get them hooked. A little bit more on the bait casters. Some people, they think you have to have a really high capacity bait cast reel because these bigger stripers, and don't get me wrong, there's giant stripers in our lakes. There's been a couple of 40-pound class fish that were verified at Beltsville being caught. I know that there's fish close to that 40-pound range in Wallenpaupack. There's a number of 30-pound range fish in Nakamixon. I know people that have caught these things, and I've been involved in that myself. So again, it comes back down to the technique. I like to use a bait cast reel, not a real small one, but not one of those giant ones either. Something that's comfortable in my hand and something that is comfortable for the technique that I'm throwing. And I do use braided line, and I do use a leader most of the time when I'm fishing for stripers. And so on the bottom of the reel, I'll have some kind of backing. Usually that'll be 10-pound test monofilament line. And then I'll have 75 yards of braided line that I put on the reel. That's 225 feet. And then I'll put a rod length or two of, depending on what I'm throwing. If it's top water, it'll be mono. If it's going under the water, it'll be fluorocarbon. That's the leader that I'll use. And then, I've never had a fish spool me. That doesn't mean that it can't happen, because it certainly can. It does. I did have a fish, maybe two, that took me down to the backing, but I was able to catch back up to that fish and get them back and catch those fish. So, you tie a good knot, put down to your backing, and you fight the fish, and you get it, and you get that thing to the boat as best you can. So I feel that these reels for the stripers that I'm fishing for, I don't think I have an opportunity for a fish much more than 45 pounds. That's probably the top range of the fish that are in the area, the country that I'm fishing. So I feel that I have the right equipment and the right expertise to land that if I come across that opportunity. Don't get me wrong, it would be better if I did have a higher capacity reel in those situations, because they could pull more line and I'm less likely to have something go wrong. But again, it comes down for me, it's more important to have the right equipment for the technique that I'm doing than to be thinking about, I got to have some equipment because this fish is going to be really strong, really fast, or really big. I would rather learn how to catch that fish with the equipment that I have for the technique that I'm doing than to have the wrong equipment for the technique. Because if I'm using something, let's say I'm using a very heavy rod, well, I'm going to be frustrated, because if I'm using a light lure, I'm not going to get it out as far as I want. I'm going to try to cast it harder and farther. When I do that, I'm going to get backlashes. I'm going to get frustrated. And it just doesn't make for a pleasant fishing experience for me. I'd rather have the right equipment for the technique that I'm throwing. And so I guess, Jake, that would be my answer to the question. I hope that makes sense to you. If you have any other questions, just feel free to ask. I might have missed something in this whole dissertation, but I wanted to get the point across that what works best for me is to focus on the technique that I'm using, and that there is a difference whether or not you're fishing from the shore or from a boat. A boat gives you a lot more options because you can go out to deep water, that fish can go down underneath you. On the shore, the fish goes down underneath you and you're standing on the shore. It's on the bottom and it's dragging on the bottom. And so that's why my brother takes that back hook off of his baits. I don't do that when I'm out in a boat because I don't feel that I need to. I can get that fish out over deeper water, and I have that extra hook on there if I need it. So it just depends on what you're doing, the technique that you're using. You want to definitely go to the heaviest line, the heaviest rod, and the best capacity reel that you can get away with for the technique that you're utilizing. But you don't want to sacrifice your length of cast and your ability to get to the fish by having too beefy of tackle when you're fishing for these fish. It's better to go with the tackle that's best suited for the technique, my experience. That may be different though, like, again, that could be different. I don't fish bait, for example, so I'm always throwing lures, and so everything that I choose is set up to throw the lures that I'm using. If you're fishing bait, that could be a whole different scenario, right? If you're out in a boat, you could chuck that bait out there, move your boat, drift your boat away from it, and you'll see most of the striper guides, for example, they're going to have the heavy rods. And I would too if I was doing that. I'd have heavier rods, I'd have bigger capacity reels, I'd use heavy line where I can get away with it, and I'd fish the bait that way. But when I'm fishing lures, I'm not trolling. I'm usually, just casting and reeling back and doing that kind of thing. So, I like to use the rods that are set up for the techniques. Just depends what you're doing. Bait fishing, totally different scenario. Hope that answers your question, and I hope you guys found that helpful. If you did, give me the thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, very important. Share with your friends, keep commenting, let me know what your thoughts are. If you have some ideas for videos, I'd be happy to entertain that and try and get that content to you just like this one. Can't wait to get out of the water. It's March now, I think today is March 18th, and it's colder than it was a couple weeks ago. Instead of getting warmer, it's getting colder. It's supposed to warm up, but then it rains. So eventually we'll be able to get out there and do some good fishing. Be safe out there, and as always, may God bless your fishing endeavors.